Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it might be, wherever you are. Happy time zone. Morning, Christos.
Good morning. It's still morning in Seattle, so actually it's super morning. It's rainy and dark outside. It feels like it's the end of the night.
It was rainy and dark here yesterday, but it's not rainy nor dark. It's a little chilly, however. It's
I
like
wonder why. It's winter.
it was like 45. I know. But, like I sit here in the basement at my house,
You do.
and that's where my office is.
You
And
need to move your office somewhere else because that's becoming a common theme.
Yeah.
I'm in the basement.
I'm in
Let's
the
move you
basement.
up to
It's
the living
cold,
room.
and I don't like it. So, and my OneDrive's broken. My phone keeps ringing, which is really, really getting quite annoying at this point. Like, why do you need to call somebody to fix their OneDrive? My OneDrive's broken. Just please, somebody fix it. I don't need.
I would expect them to internally send you a Teams invite and do it over Teams. I don't get why they have to call you.
I don't
It's
either.
weird.
I
Yeah.
don't either. So if my phone's been buzzing off the desk all morning. It's like half dead already. So, anyway, welcome back to another riveting episode of Identity Crisis.
I love it. Riveting. Today is going to be exciting. I think we're moving past H3 Tech Skype from India. Yeah. Not dubious at all.
Only a matter
Yeah.
of time.
But today's episode, we've been discussing about that all last week, and we're really excited because we're getting to the meaty bits of identity. By the way, if you want to join us after the show, or if you have any questions, make sure to follow us on Discord or join us on Discord. The link is at the top of the stream, so you just find there 45 show
Yep.
Discord join. Yep, and share your stories as well. For a
And of
chance
course,
to
you
win some
can
cool stuff.
you can always join the chat over at aka.ms/45 show, which is or on
Yes.
Twitch. We're 45
Yeah.
show on Twitch. That's sort of our main chat. So, Thrashing Code is here, so we can get started. Thank you for the.
There you go.
for the
That's
blessing.
what I was waiting.
That's what we
Thank
were
you,
waiting on.
Thrashing Code. Good
So,
morning to you as well, sir.
so our series, the Identity Crisis series, is all about. I don't know anything about identity. Let's talk about what happens. Let's talk about what it is. Let's talk about what happens. Let's talk about some of the reasons why it is the way it is. Right? I think that's one of the big things that we get a lot is like, well, here's how you do it. We don't talk a lot about why you do
Why.
things the way you do.
Yep.
And last week we talked a lot about history and sort of how we got here in a way. This week we're gonna jump into kind of a scenario, and hopefully we'll have enough time to jump out and go look at some actual stuff.
Yeah, click on
So-
the link above if you want to see the previous episode, the history of. Well, my hand is out of the frame. About the history of identity and how we got here. That's right, JP. And now,
So today we're gonna do a bit of a scenario thing, right? So we work for a place called Big Bad Business Cards, right? They're big, they're bad, and they're for serious business. They're huge. There's a guy called Dom Jolly. He's like a comedian, I guess, over in the UK. And he has this series of videos where he has an enormous cell phone. It's like 3.5 or 4 feet tall. And he goes to he's like in a library. He's on the subway. He's in all these different places. And he picks up this enormous cell phone and starts shouting into it. And he says, "Oh, I can't talk right now. I'm in the bathroom. I'm on the and it's absolutely
subway,
hilarious."
yeah.
There's something that, and maybe it's me, I don't know, but there's something I enjoy. Things that are comically oversized, and
what do you know about this UK comedian? And I don't know him. And I lived in the UK for 20 years. I am surprised.
maybe he's not very well known. I don't know. Maybe he's just some random guy on YouTube, but he's pretty funny. And so I found this enormous business card, and I thought, oh, this is perfect. Somebody makes these. In fact, you can even order these. So we've got a fictitious company called Big Bad Biz Cards that are wrapped around it, but they're kind of hurting right now because who needs a business card when we're all stuck at home, right?
Yeah.
I guess I could get some to wallpaper my office and soundproof it or something. But so instead, at Big Bad Biz Cards, we're going to start to venture into virtual business cards, right?
Ooh, I like it.
So now you can get an enormous, oversized virtual business card for your You
I
get an
know I'm out
enormous.
of focus. I don't know what's happening. My Logitech Brio is misbehaving.
Yeah. So now you can. Now we're gonna sell these enormous business cards that go in your email signature, right? And in some ways, to be quite honest, I think this is actually better. Like, there's a guy I used to work with years and years and years ago, and you'd get a one-word response, and then you'd get a 25-line signature underneath it.
You also get the messages like my hours are not your hours, so you don't have to respond.
It's like every certification this guy had ever taken was listed there. So, so we're going to venture into virtual business cards because we want people to remember you for better or for worse. They might remember you because you're the obnoxious guy who put a 4 meg JPEG in your email signature. But whatever, they remember you, right? So when you meet them in person finally, when you get your vaccination or you decide that your company says that you can leave again. When you meet them, they're going to say, "Oh, I remember you. You're that guy who crashed my inbox when I was trying to read this on my phone." So we've got this, and so we got to build an app for it, right?
Yes, please.
And we're going to do freemium because freemium is, growth hacking, all that sort of silliness. So we're going to build an app, and it's just going to be pretty simple app. It's going to be we got a free plan where people can get a card. They get one card for free. They can upload one picture, and they can upload the picture from somewhere else, from a Facebook or Google, or they can just do it from their PC. But they could also just connect to their Facebook account or something and get a picture from there.
Right.
If they pay, we'll have some paid plans that let them get more designs and more templates, but it'll also let them connect to LinkedIn, right? Because I kind of feel like the number of people or the overlap of people who would enjoy an obnoxiously large business card are also the kind of people who enjoy LinkedIn.
Oh yeah.
In some ways, LinkedIn is an obnoxiously large virtual business card already. But anyway, so we want them to be able to connect to LinkedIn. And then get analytics too, like who's reading my big business card, who's clicking links on my big business card, right? So the net is we're going to have these essentially two types of users and two users with two different levels of of access, right? Certain things are going to unlock once you pay us or whatever. So it's a pretty standard kind of e-commerce kind of thing, right? No, we're not building the app today, Authorization Code. We're going to talk about what we're building it, but I don't think we're going to have time to build it today. So if we look at what we need in order to do this, at the minimum, what do we need to know who a user is, right? We got to know their username. We got to know their name. We got to verify who they are, right? Geez, yeah. I mean, I guess they VCs say that 9 women can have a baby in a month. So I guess if all of you get on the stream, maybe we could build this in the next 48 minutes. But so these users have to verify who they are, right? And so then it's okay, well, cool. So my users are going to come type this stuff in. We've got multi-factor that we have to deal with, right? So
oh God, yes.
An app, SMS, a phone call, something. And SMS isn't really even that great for 2-factor anymore anyway. We really don't want you to do that if you don't have to. So we got that, and then we've got okay, cool. So if somebody's giving me their password, how are we going to store this password, right? So we kind of have two different options, because if somebody else was to have the wrong business card show up in their signature, it's going to be bad, right? Not going to work very well. So on the one hand, we can do it all ourselves, and we're going to manage it, and we have to own it, but we get total control, so we can do whatever we want. It's funny how similar this conversation is to talking to customers about moving to cloud. Is we get ultimate control on-prem, but you have to do all the work, right? And that's kind of you're going to see some common themes here, which are do things that you're really good at and let somebody else do the things that you're not, right? So the other option is to let somebody else do it, right? And there's some pros and cons, right? So the user database, you have total control. You do whatever you want to do. It's portable because everybody changes clouds every week, right? We hear that all the time, I don't want any vendor lock-in, right? Even though you've already written your app to a specific database and you've written your app with a specific language and you're consuming specific services from specific vendors, but definitely don't want vendor lock-in. So it's portable, so you can pick up your database, you can take it wherever you want, right? It's relatively simple to design and simple to understand. So if we think about like, okay, well, I've got users and they need to sign in. How do I put that into my database, right? So that's cool. The problem is that those users only exist in your database, right? So like you can't like let's say you've got 10 apps to build or something, you can't do anything there, right? It's deceptively simple. We're going to talk about why it's deceptively simple. I actually realized looking back at the deck this morning that I'm fairly certain that the first half of this presentation is really just a giant public service announcement, but we'll come back around to that. But so it is somewhat deceptively simple, and you'll see this. We start getting into the design as we go down this sort of naive path of, oh, well, I've never done this, we should go and build this. We'll start to see that maybe it isn't the best thing, right? So let's look at the two together. So we've got our user database. So now I've got to store all this user data. Hey, Sahil, yeah, so we're live on Mondays and Fridays. Tuesday, we've got a different show that goes on live on Learn TV. So this is on Learn TV and, of course, on the 45 show. So we're still doing the Monday-Friday show still here. We just have a specific series that we're doing on Tuesdays. So we've got our user database, and thanks for tuning in, by the way. So we've got our user database, but now you own all of this stuff, right? So you've got to figure out how we put users in. How do you store those users? What kind of compliance stuff do you have to deal with? How do you do MFA? Somebody says, oh, I want to use FIDO. And especially when we start looking at like business-to-business stuff where like you're trying to build SaaS and you're selling it to some huge company, like say like a Microsoft or something. Those kind of organizations are going to have requirements. And so you don't want your app to get blocked by some big corporation, especially if it's like a business-style app like ordering business cards or putting in, obnoxiously large virtual cards. So you got to be really particular. Like most people, that's table stakes. They're going to say, well, look, I mean, I don't want somebody to just have a username and password because I can't control it. What if they leave the company? I can't control that as the admin, so I'm going to have to deal with all this. Beyond that,
that's a real problem. I've been to companies where people had left, and 2 years after they left, they still had access to production systems because their credentials were never revoked or were never old, and it's not uncommon. So it might sound like science fiction, but trust me, there are a lot of companies out there that still follow bad practices.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, you think about stuff like Dropbox, right? Like, I used to use Dropbox years ago, and I used it all the time. I used it for everything, and I used it at work because it was an easy way for me to make sure I had a copy of stuff and whatever, right? And my work was suddenly like, well, we don't want you to use Dropbox. We're blocking it at the firewall because there's no way for them to manage it as an organization.
Yep.
And so they started blocking it because they had to worry about data exfiltration and everything else, right? Like, what if I worked at a bank or something? I was taking like sensitive data with me. They would have never known. And so there's this huge sort of explosion of these new, apps that are delivered over the internet. But, admins need control. And so we've kind of gotten to the point now where if you're building an app that somebody could use in business, I mean, it gets... You almost have to show up with this kind of advanced stuff, FIDO and MFA and organizational context and whatever, because people are just going to say, well, sorry, we can't use it. We'd love to use it, but we can't, and we're going to block it for all of our users. But the other big thing too is like, well, let's say I'm building an app and I've got all my users in this database, right? Like, well, now how can I do like reporting and stuff? How can I let you as the customer report on your own data? Because now I've got this really super sensitive data in my database right next to your data, and it just becomes a headache. There are risks, of course, going the other way when you're letting somebody else do it, which is that you could not implement something correctly, right? Like not use the service correctly. You could have a really terrible provider. We've certainly seen that happen where you get an email and the provider's like, oh, by the way, somebody may have accidentally accessed your account and stolen literally everything, and they've been there for 2 years, right? Sahil, it is on YouTube, just via our normal stream. Learn TV is Microsoft's streaming platform, I guess, for broadcast. So the link's in the chat. We've certainly seen providers, though, who, everybody gets emails. I get like 5 emails a day. Hey, by the way, sorry, we're pretty sure we got breached, And so if your identity provider is like that, especially larger identity providers who are constantly being attacked and constantly on the radar, that's a risk, right? You don't have control over everything. And then, of course, too, like organizational stuff. So, like, what do I do to support an organization? What does my organization support? Are they going to let me do this kind of work? Are they going to let me buy this software and use it? So there are a lot of different questions that come out of that. So let's look at what is in our app database. So we're going to go down the route of setting up our app database ourselves, and just sort of naively like, oh yeah, we're totally going to own our own credentials, right? So we got some tables at the bottom. These are all about getting our orders out the door, right? Good morning, Chicken Man. So this is all, these are just tables for orders, right? For an inventory and whatever. And so we got a user, and the user's got their username and password, and their password solved, and their display name, blah, blah, blah. Their address, their orders, that sort of thing, right? So we can keep up with what they have as a sort of an MVP, right? And somebody comes in and says, well, okay, that's cool, but like we've got a freemium model here. Like we can't just let anybody get to anything, right? So now we got to have roles. So now we've added, 5 new tables to our database to include role data. So what's a role? What's an organization, right? Because somebody at their company is going to say, well, this person should be an admin and I'm going to pay for them. And somebody else might say, well, this person's not, right? So now we got to figure out what a role means. We've got to store them somewhere. We have to link them to our users. We got to do all this work on our own. This is just the database, too. Not to mention, we've got an entire UI and admin interface that we have to go build to make this work, right? So I got to go build a bunch of UI that says, let me see my users, let me add a user to a role, let a user leave a role, all that kind of stuff, right? So then we say, cool, all right, let's let people use their social accounts, because somebody comes in and says, oh, we need to use a social account. I need to be able to sign in with my Facebook account, right? Well, now we've got more tables. So now we end up with more tables to map claims and get the identity providers, whatever. And I mean, this is kind of MVP, bare bones, just enough to get users signed in to place an order. There's a bunch of extra stuff that we're not even really talking about that would need to exist here in like a proper implementation. But so now we've gotten to the point where we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, we got 6, 7 tables to support or 8 tables to support user roles and social identities, and we have 7 tables in our app itself. 6 tables in our app itself. So now we have more tables to manage our users and passwords than we do the actual app itself, right? So we get our app out, everything's cool, we've got all this work going, and then our management's like, hey, cool, so one of our customers called and they said they absolutely have to have MFA. Not an option, right? We can't use this if we don't have MFA. What if somebody comes and puts an offensive Twitter link in my CTO's signature or something, right? So we got to have MFA. So then you go back and you're like, all right, fine. And then they come back and say, okay, cool, but not all the time. You can't MFA somebody all the time because that's annoying, right? Every time they come to the page, they're going to have to MFA again, and that's super, super annoying, right? So we don't want to do that, right? Well, and if your CTO shoots himself in the foot or herself in the foot, there's not really much we can do about it. But if somebody else does it, then at least it's plausible deniability, right? So then somebody comes in and says, we don't need it all the time. We need rules engines. And I don't know about your experience, but in my experience of building like enterprise software and commercial stuff, people love to talk about rules engines. They think that these are magic unicorns of rules engines, right? And of course, no 2 rules engines are ever the same, right? And so because of that, so our boss comes back and says, Jones, you can't MFA somebody every time. You got to give my people away. You got to give our customers a way to say, hey, only MFA in these cases, right?
Yep.
So then you got to go build a bunch of extra tables, and I didn't do diagrams for that because it got so small it was unreadable. But so we've got all these extra things, right? So we've got our MFA set up, we've got social, we've got roles, we've got usernames and passwords, we've got all this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And our app's doing well, and then our boss comes in and says, oh, by the way, this is great. Now, now we need to do this for all of our apps. And if you remember from last week, the proliferation of apps is a real thing, right?
Oh yeah.
So
every organization will have. Damn. Yes.
Right. So you've got hundreds, dozens, whatever. Even if you've got 2 or 3 apps, let's just say you've got a mobile app and your web app, right? I mean, just those 2. Well, now suddenly we've got to figure out like how do we make sure this is available in both? And then somebody's built a support and admin app, and that needs to have all this stuff in it too. And someone else has built a special one-off app for a very special big customer. And so then this gets us to you, which is where you as the developer, you're so upset because you got all this work to do, and you're so upset you cry in the shower, and you didn't even take your clothes off. You don't even know what day it is. You don't know what time it is, right? So, if after all that, you still think that you want to store your users' passwords and manage all this work
Still
on
convinced.
your own, if you're still not convinced, look at all these other people who tried to do it unsuccessfully.
Yeah.
See, exactly, Chicken Man. He's so distraught because his boss is telling him he's got all this stuff to do that he didn't even get in the shower correctly. Like, it's been that bad of a day.
These numbers are slightly out of date by a year, so I think we're 496 pawn websites, about 2.5 billion pawn accounts, and it's growing insanely fast. So it's a sad realization that people are still getting it wrong, even in 2021.
Yep. And that's the thing. These are big companies with big engineering teams and a very, very vested interest in keeping that kind of stuff safe, right? And so, if they can't get it right, what are the chances that a team of 2 or 3 folks who have an actual app they need to ship, who suddenly have a ton of extra stuff that they have to do on top of figuring out sign in and sign out and everything else? Not to say there aren't some amazing software wizards out there, but that's not your priority, right? Our priority is not building the most secure, robust identity system in the world for our business card app. Our business is selling business cards, and so I don't really want to do this. Yep. The problem is, you notice all these logos that are up here on the screen, and you see. We want you to stay out of the news, right? That's the whole premise, and you can't even see my silly slide because my face is in front of it. But Smokey the Bear says only you can prevent yourself from being in the news, and that's because we don't want you. We don't want you in the news.
Are you going to talk about the pit of success? Am I stealing your thunder? I missed that line.
No, it's fine.
Oh,
okay. No, it's fine. No, we don't. That's the whole thing. Like. We've got a team. We've got a team of 1,000, 1,500 people who sit around and build identity systems. Our competitors are the same way. The Amazons and Oktas and Auth0s of the world. They have hundreds of engineers who focus on building identity systems and building sign-in systems, and a lot of it is so that you don't have to, right? A lot of it's so that you can focus on building the app that you need to build that makes your company money, but still be confident in the fact that you've got. Be confident that you've got. A secure, reliable implementation for signing users in and knowing who they are, right? Don't say that kind of stuff, AZ Wildfire. OneNote is not the best password manager.
We will mute you for a while.
So the net is, the net is, please don't store your own passwords.
Yes.
Please don't try to implement them. And I went and took a look before the show and before I started working on this deck. So many tutorials and getting started and let's build a web app with Node. Let's build a web app with .NET. Mm-hmm. So many of those tutorials. They do user login and they store it in Mongo or in MySQL or in SQL Server or wherever, right? They store it in the data store for the application. And chances are, especially if you're new, if you've never really built software before, if you're just getting into it, you're going to encounter a lot of those kinds of things. You're going to encounter a lot of these, click here, download this code, and now you've got sign in your app, and it ends up getting very dangerous. And now you've got something that of questionable provenance that's running in your app and touching your users' credentials, and you don't want to ever You don't ever touch your user's credentials. No touching.
I've sent you a link on OBS Ninja. This is something that Troy Hahn has covered in the past, and if you ever search for password reset, if I remember correctly, or I forgot password name, this would come as first or second result in Google or Bing, and it was littered with security holes. Unfortunately, the problem with this approach is that if you put a blog post out there, there will be new developers that will search for something, and then they will land on your website or your blog, and they will follow the instructions that you put out there, and chances are that they will compromise the security of their team or company. And that's our challenge, educating people not to write these kind of blogs, not to do these implementations other than, I don't know, educational stuff. But I've analyzed this before when I was doing Oauth with customers training, and it was it was really scary when you think about the fact that a lot of people will just follow blindly these instructions.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? Like, how would you know? How would you know otherwise that maybe this wasn't a good thing? And I think it's becoming a little bit more pervasive and sort of general knowledge that things like MFA are things you should use. Like, my parents use like the Authenticator app and stuff like that. But, you know, if you're just starting and you just need to get something out the door, when we all make shortcuts all day. We always, everybody does, because you got to get something out the door, right? Software is never finished, and it can always be improved. But, forgetting to put an index on your SQL table, or, it might have terrible performance. It might even bring your whole site down, right? But, letting your passwords leak or storing your users' credentials in a insecure manner, that's the kind of stuff that puts you on the news. That's the kind of stuff that keeps people from ever using your software again. And it can spell the death of an app, right? And the other side to that is you think about all of the passwords that people reuse, because like password policies are so arcane, especially in businesses. So, we joke about winter 2020 ! As being a password, and there are probably people who will see this video at some point who are like, oh man, that's my password, But because people have to change them all the time. The 90 days, the 90-day changes, and the 60-day changes, and the 48-day changes, and all that sort of silliness. That kind of stuff, like, that's not good for security, because now you're just asking people to remember yet another arcane series of digits. So there are all sorts of things we can talk about around passwords and whatever, but the best password is one that you don't know. As a developer,
I don't know
the best
my
password
I hope you don't know your passwords.
Yeah, I don't know my password. Like, I use the LastPass, and I'm trying one password out, by the way. I'm gonna see if it's worth switching.
Dude, you should change to. I mean, I've tried both, but Bitwarden is where it is. I think there was an issue. A lot of blogs by security experts and articles about 1Password. I'm not taking a hit on it, but yeah, I can forward them to you later on. But it's how they handle your data, which is the scariest bit.
Yeah, I'll be curious to know. Like, tell us what you use in the chat. Well, I'm curious, because we use LastPass for a long time, and LastPass works, but the interface is just so miserably bad to use and buggy and just blech. So, Chicken Man says KeyPass XC. I have to check all these out. I'm going to keep notes so I can go check these out. Anyway, so yeah, the net of it is don't put passwords in your app. That's why I said at least the first half of this is going to be a PSA about don't store data, don't store passwords on your own, and don't keep them on sticky notes on your monitor. So
God, yes.
The most effective way is to make somebody else do it, and make somebody else do it who knows what they're doing. The shared responsibility model, and you see that thrown around a lot in cloud, but it kind of makes sense here too, right? So if we look at what this looks like, some of this is what we own or what you might own as a customer, and some of this is what we as the provider might own, right? And so there are some things that you always have to do, and those are these things at the top, right? Like, who are the accounts and what kind of devices are being used, whatever. But then as we start getting further down this grid, you see things like identity and directory infrastructure, and like obviously in things when you're on-prem, you own that entirely. But the further left you go, the closer you get to platform services and software services, the more that becomes a shared responsibility. So the underlying infrastructure, the hosts, the networks, the data centers, all of that is done by us, right? It's all owned by us because we're the provider. Things like the OS, like when you're consuming a service, you're not concerned with the OS that's running on there. You're not even really concerned with the applications because you're not building any of the applications to run the identity service. You're building your app to order obnoxiously large business cards. And that's a big difference because in our current model, we own everything. We own the entire stack. Even if we go put this into a cloud somewhere, we're still responsible for this database that's got all these users' credentials in them, right? So we want to make somebody else do the hard work of storing the credentials, making sure the user signs in, doing things like MFA, doing things like policy and rules engines and all that sort of stuff that's related to our user database. Let's just make somebody else do it, right? So by making somebody else do it, now our database is much simpler because now our database just has a user ID and an identity provider unique ID in it. So we managed to get rid of all of our extra tables that have all the role stuff and all the organization stuff. All that's gone, right? And it's been replaced with a user ID, which is just like a unique key that we're using across, to identify a user, and the identity provider's unique ID. And that's it. That's the only bit of user data that we're storing because the only extra thing we need is their physical address to mail them things, right? Or their shipping address and their billing address because we're shipping them physical things. But that's it. So the only bit of PII, if you want to call it that we have in here, really comes down to our address table, right? Because the address table is what's uniquely identifying about those users. And in some cases, you could even make the argument that, well, maybe we boot our user address stuff up to the provider too. Let's let the provider store that for us, and we'll just get it when we need it. And that way it's totally transitive, right? One of the things we didn't talk about a lot was even like the whole thing about payments, right? Payment data and payment systems and whatever, because obviously you got to pay for these enormous business cards. And, you think about doing payments. Would you go and build a payment network yourself? Probably not.
No.
You're going to have to go through a Stripe or a Spot On or some payment processor to process your payments. You're not going to do that on your own. And it's a liability thing for you too, because once you start capturing people's credit card data or whatever, now suddenly you're on the hook to protect it and secure it. I'd much, much, much rather give my payment data to somebody else, let them manage it, PayPal or whoever. So you can almost think of the identity system as kind of being the same way, which is, well, let's give my identity to somebody else and let them deal with it. Let them deal with password reset. Let them deal with building a UI for all these different pieces that we have to have for management, for everything else, right? Let them deal with it. And I'll just pay them a modest fee for doing it, right? And in most of the cases, a lot of these identity systems are so cheap that they're free to start and near free even for hundreds of thousands of users, right? So it is very much a commodity service at this point, and not a service that you want to go build on your own. So we've taken all of our user stuff out of our database. Well, now we got to go figure out what to do in our data in our identity provider, right? So now it's moving day. So we got all this stuff that we're going to t-shirt cannon over to our provider. All these things that we're going to let them do for us. So, of course, the first one is our database of users. So we got to have our users. They got to exist somewhere. So we're going to let the provider deal with that, including their credentials, including their MFA stuff. Things like groups, all the role and organization data that was there, their social stuff. We're going to punt all of that up to the provider and let the provider do it for us. And then we've also got apps, and apps is kind of an interesting thing here because if we think about historically or before, what we had our app, we had our user database, right? They were the same. They were one and the same. It was a web app. You go to the web app. Web app has a user database. You sign in and you're signed in, right? Well, now what we've done is we've taken our user database and we've split it from our application. So our app now has no user data in its database with the exception of this unique user ID, right? So then we think, okay, cool. Well, before I made a SQL query, how do I go and sign a user in, right? So now we're looking at moving. This is when things like Oauth 2 and OpenID Connect come into play. Because Oauth 2 and OpenID, these are the protocols that underpin a lot of this sort of internet sign-in and whatever. But at the end of the day, it's really not dramatically dissimilar from I'm making a SQL query to go and sign a user in, right? Logically, that's the way you can think about it as well. I got to go sign a user in, and the return or the result of this transaction is that the user's going to be signed in. Just like in your login method that goes and queries a database and hashes a password and does all the work to figure out if you typed in the right password, you're going to get a result back of did the user sign in or not. And that's basically what you're going to get back from these protocols, right? So there are lots of different flows and grants and all sorts of things about it. We're not going to get into all of them. We're going to kind of get into one of the more important ones, and then we'll jump into some of the other ones probably in a later show. But we're going to talk briefly about authorization code and what that means, right? Because at this point we just need to sign a user in, right? So we need to sign this user in, and we can't do it with our SQL query like we did before. So instead, the user comes to our app just like they did before. They get sent over to the user database, which is our identity system, and they sign in. They tap, tap, tap. They get MFA'd. They do whatever it is that their identity provider is configured to force them to do. And then the identity system or the user database that's now external sends them back to your app, and the app has this one-time code, right? And that one-time code is, you can think of it almost as a one-time password. All of this is happening in the user's browser itself. So your web server is kind of out of the loop at this point. It's just happening inside of your browser. So I come to the app says, hey, I don't know who you are, but I do know someone who might know who you are. Sends you over to sign in, click, 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 at an Azure Id or an Oauth or wherever, a Facebook, a Google, doesn't matter. They send you back. So you sign in, that transaction ended. You sign in at the identity system. They send you back over to the application with this one-time code. Now, the one-time code itself isn't actually useful except for one thing, and that's step 5, which is the app takes that code, that one-time use code, and it sends it through its own channel. So it's not through the browser. That's the key point, is that we're out of the browser at this point. It sends them back. It sends that code in like an HTTP request, basically an API call, back to the identity system or to the user database to say, hey, I've got this one-time code. Give me whatever the one-time code represents. And if the one-time code is valid, then the identity system will return that data and say, cool, here's the user's data, right? On the surface, it seems fairly straightforward. And in fact, it actually is kind of simple. I mean, the problem is that, which we're going to get into in a second, is there's a bunch of extra stuff that's sort of happening as a part of these movements. And because it's happening in front of you in the browser as the user, it has a tendency to get a little confusing and introduces extra places where this isn't going to work, right? Oh, I got redirected to this site, but it wasn't the right one. And then it told me it couldn't send me back because like a reply URL was wrong. Like, what does that mean? And so there are all sorts of things in here that could cause this not to work. But the big thing that we haven't mentioned yet is when that app makes that server-to-server call, right? It's an API call. Dude, nothing happened before that, right? So you can kind of think of it as, I got a letter in the mail, and that letter in the mail had like a 4-digit code in it, right? And it says, when you get this 4-digit code, I want you to pick up the phone and call this number and give them the code, right? So you pick up the phone, you call the number, and they say, hey, well, give us the code, right? So you're just like, cool, yeah, I got the code. Here's the code 0444 or whatever, right? Well, the person on the other end of the phone actually doesn't know who you are. You have a code, which is fine, but you don't have anything else that identifies who you are. And that's a risk. Because remember, this one-time code here, step number 4, that one-time code is in the browser. And because it's in the browser, it means a malicious extension, malware on the PC, any number, a rogue network admin on your work network or something, or somebody, a bad hotspot at a coffee shop, like any number of different things could cause that one-time code to be compromised, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why it's also critically important that the thing that redeems that code, so your web server, your app server itself, also identifies itself. It also has to say, I am app123. I am the bigbadbizcards.com website, and I've got an order and a user just signed in and that's who I am. Here's the code that you gave me, in addition to a set of credentials that identify the application itself. And that's key. This is where a lot of the extra complexity comes from, because now we start talking about things like client secrets and client credentials and all sorts of, or I'm sorry, not client credentials, but client secrets and client certificates and all these extra bits in order to make that call work, right? And there are other pieces of security that are happening in here too. Step 4, for example, oops, I did not mean to go there yet. Step 4, right here in the middle, that's essentially an allow list. So once you've signed in, your ability to go back to an arbitrary web server is restricted. You can only go back to web servers that you've said, hey, this is where my app is running. So that's what's called the redirect URI or the reply URL. Different systems call it different names. But essentially it means, hey, identity system, hey, user database, don't let a user sign in and try to send a code or send a token back to just some random address on the internet. It's got to be one that I've told you up front is an allowed one. So that's the whole allow list or reply URL list that happens when you do app registration, which we are going to get into in a minute. So this whole thing of the app itself needs to authenticate itself, that's a hard problem to solve when you are not on a server, right? So imagine you've got your cell phone. You got a mobile app, Android app, iOS app, whatever. Imagine you're building a JavaScript app that's running solely in the user's browser. None of these things can keep secrets. My phone can't keep a secret. It's an Android phone, so it definitely can't keep a secret. Right? I don't have Facebook installed, but I mean, it's close. So this phone, a user's going to hold their phone and run your app. And if they hold their phone and run your app, that means they can decompile the app, they can go and look at strings in the app, they can do all sorts of different things to that app and find secrets. You can't really ship a secret on a mobile app and have any confidence that it hasn't been compromised, right? Very difficult to do. Same with a JavaScript app. If I was to go run a JavaScript app, good morning, John Calloway, thanks for joining. If I was to go run a JavaScript app, it's running in the browser, right? Nothing stops me from hitting F12 and seeing all the different variables that are going to be there, including a shared secret. And you can't do that. I can't ship a shared secret in the browser. I can't ship one on a mobile device. And because of that, I can't do it on desktop, right? I mean, think about how easy it is to go and look at files that are running to run a WPF or a Cocoa app or something on Mac OS. Like, it's really easy. I mean, Mac OS, you right click the executable and say show package contents, and there you go. You got plist, you got everything you need. Where are you going to store a secret? Where are you going to store a secret in a client app? And essentially, you really aren't. Right? It's just one of those things that you can't do. So because of that, there are some alternate ways to do this, which I don't think I have a slide for. We're not going to talk about. There's another way to do this called PKCE, which is a way to do this out in the clear, and we're going to get to that. Probably going to get to that next week.
Yep.
So anyway, the net is we've got these two things. They kind of have to do this, public. I know who you are, you know who I am, and we have to keep a secret. They have to do some of this in public, and they do a little bit of it in private. So this is cool. So now at this point, the user signed in, and you know who they are in your app, and you're done. So now sign in is finished. You know who the user is. You can look them up in your own database if you have any extra data about them, like their addresses or their order history or whatever. You can go and look that up, because what you get back is that unique identifier from the database, from the identity system that says this is who the user is, right? So let's talk about these apps for a minute, because app itself is kind of a generic term, especially when you start getting into like if you start looking into more about OAuth 2 and OpenID, you're going to see app used a whole lot, right? So you'll see this term app, and it usually means one of two things. And we call them an app. We call them app registrations, for example, in Azure Id. And there are two main types. You got resource and you've got clients. And a resource typically, and not all the time, but a resource typically is an API or something similar. So you can think of the the AWS console API. the API, the Azure REST API, the Microsoft Graph API lets you connect to services. Your own API that you've written, that you've built as the backend for your mobile app or something. Those are resources. It's called a resource because it's a thing that's serving something else. It's a thing that's providing data to a user or to an application. That resource has the ability to say, cool, I want to let people use this data, but I don't want them to use all of the data. We talked about impersonation last week, impersonation versus delegation. This is sort of an implementation of delegation. So your resource is saying, I'm going to create a scope, and it's going to be called user.read, right? Saying user.read means I can read the user. It doesn't mean I can do anything else. And that's a scope, right? It's an arbitrary string that you as the developer have to go and enforce, right? So something completely, it has nothing to do with us per se, except that we give you a way to manage that. We give you a way to declare them and to let other apps request them. But ultimately, your app is responsible for enforcing, okay, a user showed up and they've got user.read. What does that mean? And when we talked about delegation a little last week, it's sort of like if, say I want you to have, to be able to read my calendar, say I want you to be able to read my Google Calendar, right? Well, you shouldn't have access to my Gmail and my Google Voice and Google Fi and all these other Google Photos and all these other services just because I need you to read my calendar. But if I give you my username and password, that's what you're going to have. You're going to have access to every single thing. I can't use Google as an example because all these devices are like, what? Did you say something? Did you call my name? Oh, sorry, I can't help you there. But if I give you my Google password, I'm done. You can do anything as me, and that's impersonation. So when you're building an API, if I'm building the Gmail or the Google Calendar API, right? When I'm doing that, I'm going to say, well, somebody might want to use an app that just lets them read the calendar. And so I'm going to make my API have the ability to restrict and say, somebody can just say, oh, I just want to have read access to the calendar for this app that I'm using. Because maybe it's kind of sketchy or I'm not too sure about it or whatever, right? So the resources expose... the balance went wonky. I didn't think I touched anything. Maybe I angered the Google by talking meanly about it. But
And you're talking about it again, so you're challenging fate. It's fine now. Maybe it was a fluke in the stream.
Anyway, so we've got these resources, and the resources publish... They're the ones that typically publish data. So it's an API that I can connect to as a user from an application that I built or that somebody else built, and I can see the data that's in it. In order to restrict that, we use a scope. Now, client apps are apps that are going to be accessing those APIs. So if my resource app is the backend API for my app, the client app is the mobile app. It's the front-end website. It's the JavaScript spa, right? Those are the client apps. And client app, it's completely semantic. Like, you could have an app that's both a resource and a client. They don't have to... There's no hard anything here that says something must be a resource or something must be a client. The real difference is that a resource can publish a scope and say this scope is available for other apps to request, and clients typically ask for those permissions. So a client would say, hey, I need calendar.read in order to read your calendar. Whereas the API that has the calendar data says, I've got a scope called calendar.read available. So somebody's saying, I've got this available, and then the clients are saying, hey, I want to use that, right? And clients may have their own resources, or clients may also be resources. They may publish their own stuff. So if I'm building an app for my mobile device or something that reads my calendar and helps me schedule my day, that's going to need calendar.read, but it doesn't hold the calendar data itself. It doesn't deal with the calendar. It's not the source of truth for the calendar data. The other services, like the Google Calendar API, the Microsoft Exchange or Graph API or Outlook.com API, whatever. Those are the services, the resources that actually own the calendar data themselves, and they're the ones that say, hey, I've created this scope so that users can let these client apps use their data, but be really restrictive in what they can and can't do, right? So, I don't have any more slides, which is good because we've only got 5 minutes left, but I am going to pull up my browser here for a minute. So, let's go look really quickly at what all of those terms kind of mean relative to the kind of stuff that we work on, right? So, I'm going to go to the Azure Id Portal. Now, Azure Id is one of many different identity systems that are out there, but the concepts are all the same. So by virtue of the fact that we are standards based, it means that most of what you're going to see is sort of, there may be implementation details that are a little bit different, but they follow the spec, and because they follow the spec, most of the bits are the same. They might just have different names in different places, right? So I talked about apps. So when we register an application, we're saying, hey, this application is a thing that exists. So let's call this the Big Bad Business Card Backend API. So this is the resource. In fact, I'll even put the name resource after it. So this is the resource, and it's just an API, so I actually don't need any of these other things, so I'll hit register. And so now the identity system, the user database, knows, hey, users are going to try to sign into this API. They're going to try to sign in. The API needs to know who they are. And that's where this expose an API thing comes into play. So maybe we want to add a scope here. Call this BBBC for Big Bad Biz Cards. So maybe we want to let people see their orders, but only read them, right? So we'll do orders.read. And allows read only view of orders for a user. So this is just for a user, right? And we're going to add this scope. So now let's go create a client app, right? So we've got this scope. It's called orders.read. So let's go create our client app. We're going to create a new registration. We're going to call this the BBBC order reporting client, whatever, right? So we've got our reporting client. We're going to call this a public client, which actually means it's a mobile app. So we'll just do my app Auth. This is just an implementation detail of our system, so you don't have to worry about this part specifically. But we're saying, hey, this application is the client, and so we want permissions to the API. So if you remember the one we just did a second ago, the one that we just did was we exposed an API, right? Now we want to actually consume that API. So let's add a permission. And if we look at my APIs, you'll notice BBBC backend API resource, right? And if we look, these are delegated. So this is doing it as the user. The user is delegating to us and saying, cool, don't impersonate me. I'm going to give you explicit access to go and access my stuff. So we say, yes, cool, orders.read. So now when we build our mobile app can request this resource, right? They can request and say, hey, so when we say in our code, for example, when we request a token, and we say, yeah, well, we need a scope to request, right? We're going to request this entire scope. So this entire thing here, this whole URI, this is sort of the scope, right? This is the thing that defines the scope. And so by requesting this, when we do our sign-in, when we go through that whole tango of redirection back and forth, we're saying, hey, we want to sign the user in, and we want to also talk to this service. So I need anything that comes back to have this bit of metadata in it to say, to give me this, right? So now our mobile app, our order reporting client app, when it calls that API, it's going to send a token in that says, I got this scope successfully. And because the mobile app and the backend API both understand this user database and both trust this user database, then the backend app can say, cool, well, you sent me some data that said that you have this permission, so now I can go and do something about that. So now the backend API is the thing that actually does the enforcement and says, hey, cool, I see what this is, and so the user has this, so I should only send read data, and my write APIs, for example, should just not work, right? They should return an error or a 404 or something and say, sorry, you can't write to this resource because you don't have access to do it, right? And there's a whole lot of other stuff that we're going to talk about in later weeks about, okay, cool, so we've got these things floating around, but how do I send this? How do I tell the service as the mobile client, hey, I've got this and it works. I promise it works. I promise that the user said it was okay. Like, you can't do that. So next week we'll get into tokens and what those look like in terms of how these different things get sent back and forth, more sort of in implementation, and how you can have confidence that it's actually done securely, right? And then I saw there was one question. And yes, Steven Solano, Stevan. I don't want to mispronounce, but Stevan. Yeah, like Christos said. Yeah, like Christos said, MS Graph can do that. So you can export app registrations and everything else. Anyway, hey, join us in Discord. Come and hang out with us. Ask your questions there. You can send us an email at 45show at Microsoft.com. Christos and I will be back on Thursday at Tulsa, at the Tulsa user group. Friday we'll be back on our regular stream with some Go people, which will be cool.
Yes.
Yeah, and so until then, don't build password databases.
Yeah.
If you do it, we'll find you, and we'll point and laugh.
And
please,
we'll help you migrate. How about that?
That's right. We'll help you migrate. So please don't use password databases. Other than that, we're out of here. We will see everybody. We'll see you all hopefully in Discord, and if not, we'll see you Thursday and Friday. Have a great week.
Have a great day, everyone.